This is the Skin Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Thomas Hitchcock, and here we'll investigate everything skin science and dissect it from a scientific perspective, analyze it from a medical perspective, critique it from a consumer perspective, and give insight from an industry perspective. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dr. Thomas Hitchcock, and in the studio I have with me Angela Wilson McDonald. How are you, Angela?
I am great. Nice to see you, Thomas.
Nice to see you too. And so what are we going to talk about today before I introduce the puzzle of the day?
This might be your favorite topic.
What could that possibly be?
We are on the brink of something very exciting at Crown Laboratories. We are launching the first live probiotic skin topical by the name of BIOJUVE. And I think you might know a little something about this topic, Thomas. As you know, as you will find out in this podcast, this topical launch is the life's work, research work of Dr. Thomas Hitchcock and his team of scientists. And Crown Laboratories is now bringing that science to life, starting this month with introduction into the market. Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you got started today, and kind of, a little bit of the history about how the BIOJUVE skin biome care line, and more importantly, the Xycrobe technology that is the power and the microbial powerhouse behind the line came to be. So you ready to get started?
I think so. But first I want to show you my puzzle. So this is the puzzle we have for today. This is actually from Ukraine, from a guy named Bruns. And this is called the Machinist Stash. And this is one of those puzzles where you basically have internal mazes. And it just has a little opening in here that you can store things in, whatever. But again, this is a great piece of metalworking. And it's actually a lot of fun for those who like to fidget as well. And so for today's puzzle, it's the Machinist Stash by Bruns. And let's get going.
Very nice. Okay, so we know you're a puzzle enthusiast.
Oh, has that been escaping people?
If this is their first one to tune into,
that's
Thomas,
true. That's
then they're just becoming familiar with that side of you.
Yes.
So let's become familiar with another side of you. Let's talk a little bit about, you and I have worked together for 9 years, and I've had the pleasure of introducing you many times over the years to audiences. Yes. Or talking about you as we talk about our different products and the scientist and the science behind our different brands at Crown Aesthetics. And I always introduce you as Dr. Thomas Hitchcock, tissue engineer and geneticist by training, and I often talk a little bit about that training. But why don't you tell us in depth kind of, from where you come so everybody can understand from where you speak from this point forward.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I've had quite a few facets to my experience, my career, during my career and training. And so you're right, I did get my doctorate in genetics at Clemson University. And so my research there was broad in the sense that it was on both prokaryotic and eukaryotic systems. That means like bacteria, as well as eukaryotic organisms, which comprises things like humans and animals and fungus and such. Anything that's not prokaryotic, So, but basically it was on DNA damage and repair. And so basically looking at these different systems and seeing how we could damage their DNA and then how they went about fixing it. And so really even before that, when I was doing my undergraduate, I was studying Neurospora crassa, which is the red bread mold. It's used a lot as a model in genetics. And these are microorganisms that aren't necessarily associated with skin that I was studying, but it is what got me interested in thinking through how intricate and how special certain microorganisms can be. So for instance, one that I studied during my doctorate research was called Deinococcus radiodurans. And so this is a bacteria that's actually quite beautiful. It's red in color. So when you grow them on a petri dish or whatnot, you get these little scarlet, like orangey red spots. And it's the reason why it's special above most other organisms in the world is that you can literally shatter its DNA. So you can expose it to radiation. That's where radiodurans comes from. It can endure radiation. You can put acid. You can put cold or hot. You can put all sorts of things that would kill or eradicate even human cells very easily. And yet it can survive. it is considered the strongest organism in the world. And that's because somehow, even though we consider these microbes inferior to us, they have methods to fix their genetics to actually continue to propagate more than humans have. And so, there's little things like that you pick up along the way that kind of start to, seed these ideas in your head. And so I went on from my doctorate, went and did postdoctorate at Duke and then subsequently at Yale universities. And that was in tissue engineering. And that was something that I really was interested in because in those days, that's when, I don't know if everybody remembers, they grew the ear on the mouse. And everybody thought that was so cool that we're going to start growing organs for people on animals. And sorry for anybody who thinks that's cruel, and that's not the intent, of course. But the idea was I was fascinated because, there are organisms in the world that can restore limbs, like starfish and stuff like that. There's lots of organisms in the world that had abilities that we don't have. And so with tissue engineering, we were kind of venturing into this field where we could actually take human tissues and grow an organ or grow something. So in my particular research, it was growing small diameter blood vessels. We also have people in our lab doing pulmonary or lung tissue and heart tissue. But I was the first person to grow a small diameter blood vessel that could actually be implantable into an organism. So we put it into a rat, showed that it was able to be functional, and then the rat didn't die. And so that was published in the literature, and very proud of that with my lab and the research we did. But the thing that I learned from that is we actually were taking cells from humans that were old. Like we would take people who are getting heart bypass surgery. And as a scientist, what you learn is that there's something called senescence, which actually we've talked about before. And it's basically something where as we get older, we get less and less ability to create more cells. And it's why we start to accumulate damage and such. And so when you take cells from the artery or from the saphenous vein of a 81-year-old and you try to grow them in a petri dish, it's very difficult because they don't grow very well. And when you try to make a blood vessel from them, they're not really secreting much collagen and elastin and stuff. And so basically you can't. So these are the people that probably need it the most because they're needing bypasses and such. And so we were able to use gene therapy to basically make their cells younger again. And interestingly, I was very closely working with a gene called telomerase, which is something that can extend telomeres, which is part of the way in which we think we can cause regression of age of cells and such. It's way more nuanced than that, but just I threw that in there for a reason that we'll get to in a second. And so I left there because I became a little bit disillusioned with tissue engineering after I started to kind of think through the fact is we could take an 81-year-old person, grow a perfect artery, put it into that person, but it doesn't systemically change anything. They still are going to have coronary artery disease or whatever. They'll still have the systemic disease, and that tissue will eventually be diseased as well. So that's when I started to think more about, well, what about the gene therapy aspect, because then we can systemically try to do things. And I ended up doing a fellowship at Weill Cornell Medical College, and we were exploring, possibility of using gene therapy techniques for multiple myeloma, which was my only kind of foray into oncology. But all that being said, throughout my research, there were things that I was doing that were kind of building ideas in my head. And so, of course, the tissue engineering thing, you might say, well, that has nothing to do with, the microbiome. But we did, when we're doing gene therapy on those cells, we had to use virus. And so you have to use bacteriophage and viruses and such in order to do this research. And so you start thinking through problems in a very different way than you do when you're not a molecular biologist or molecular geneticist. And so when I entered into the world of dermatology, it wasn't necessarily as a research position, but I came into it from a research mindset. And so I started to look across the field of what was being offered in dermatology, and I was a little shocked at how kind of little there was that was actually, in my mind, defensible from a scientific perspective. And so then I started thinking, well, how could I do it better? Because as a scientist, you don't go into seeing problems. You see, well, how would I do it better? Like, why is that a problem and how would I fix that problem? And so that's kind of where this this brainchild kind of was germinated. That's where it kind of started.
That was the first. Okay, so when you say defensible, that means that you're looking across the field, the dermatology field, and you see the products, you see the claims, but yet you're having difficulty wrapping your head around how is that scientifically the case.
Yeah, and that's where the telomerase thing that I talked about came in, because the very first, like, kind of I don't know if it's pivotal point where I kind of decided that I wanted to start making my own things came because I was in a conference and I went up to a booth that had a poster that said Nobel Prize winning technology. And so of course I caught my attention because I'm like, oh, so I thought all this was a little bit, wonky, but apparently there's something that won a Nobel Prize, So I walk up and of course there's little small print on that poster that you can't see from afar. And, I started asking questions, and they're basically, the Nobel Prize was the telomerase, which is something that I was keenly aware of because I had just spent years of my life working with. And so I'm like, okay, so you have telomerase in your cream that you're putting on somebody topically. So how did that win a Nobel? And they're like, oh, it didn't win a Nobel Prize. It was telomerase that's in it that won. And so basically I'm like, okay, so basically it's just a marketing gimmick to get me to ask you questions.
Yeah.
So then I said, okay, well, let me ask them questions then. And so I said, telomerase is a pretty big enzyme. So it works on genetic material, which is in a nucleus. So how do you get it from a topical formulation through the stratum corneum into the actual cells, and then not only in the cells, but all the way into the nucleus to actually do the work that it's supposed to be done? And the person didn't know what to say. They had nothing to say. And so they're like, well, you should talk to such and such person. I'm like, well, where are they? And they're like, well, they're not here. And so more or less, I really naively thought they really wanted to enter into a scientific dialogue. They did not. Yeah. They basically didn't want to have that level of conversation because it wasn't defensible. It was just something they were using. I mean, gimmicks kind of a harsh word to use, but really that's kind of what it was. And so in my mind, I was like, I don't want to work for something that's a gimmick. I don't want to be part of something that's a gimmick. So that's kind of what got my wheels turning as far as what would I do that it was in dermatology that's not a gimmick.
Okay, I like it. So we obviously know where you went next. You had your lab in La Jolla, California.
Oh, that wasn't next.
Oh, that wasn't next.
No, next was Ulthera.
Next was Ulthera. Okay,
Yeah.
So your first venture into medical aesthetics
was at a company that I don't necessarily want to talk about,
okay,
but then Ulthera was next.
Okay.
And then Ulthera was actually a great company.
Okay.
And Ulthera sold to MERS in 2013, I want to say. And that's really the money I made from that what allowed me to actually go and do my own thing and start my own company. But Ulthera was great because I actually was able to really get hands-on in taking the industry, and I was able to set up a biology lab at them. They didn't have a biology lab, but I was able to convince them that we were to take a technology that was on the market already and learn how to use it better by actually appreciating how it interacted with biology. And that's really always my passion when it comes to these devices. And you and I have said it many times in Doris' day when she's on, we've said this. It's not necessarily that the things that we use in our field is bad. It's that we may not be using them correctly.
Optimally.
Yeah, optimally. Yeah. Even correctly. But,
yeah.
So at Ulthera, one of the things was they were advertising a certain way to use it and then kind of wondering why only kind of 50% of people were having good responses. And I gave them my thoughts. This is why, because not everybody's morphologically the same. You have to treat based on what you see. And they had a great technology that you could actually see below the skin. So why not use that information to do better?
Your treatment, yeah.
But it was amazing how long it took me to convince people that the ultrasound that we're seeing actually could be used as a metric to how thick the skin was. Because a lot of people just didn't believe it was as thin as it was. And I had to go and do cadaver studies and animal studies and stuff. And finally, I was able to convince them that I'm, not full of
and
malarkey.
Apparently it was so convincing that the company was acquired.
I'll take the credit
for that, huh?
But yeah, that's where right before Xycrobe.
And for those who may be listening right now who don't know Ultherapy as a technology, Thomas, just a brief description of what that technology is.
So Ultherapy is micro-focused ultrasound. So basically they focus ultrasound beams or waves like you would like a light through a magnifying glass. And at the focus point of those waves, it actually heats tissue, similar to how a magnifying glass would do with sunlight. And so basically you can, without penetrating the skin, you can cause little burns or injuries under the skin. That scars over and it causes tightening because of tissue tightening due to fibrosis. So the idea is you can lift tissue. These are for people that may not want a facelift. It's a little too early for that, but they want a little bit of a lift and a tightening, and so they can get the tissue lift through that controlled injury.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. And then, so you rode off into the sunset when Ulthera was acquired by Merz and started somewhat.
I'm not sure I rode off in the sunset. I kind of like
drove off the side of a cliff.
Yeah, drove off the side of a cliff.
So you drove off the side of the cliff and started your own company at that time. Talk just a little bit about what that looked like.
Well, it's actually two companies.
Okay.
Of course, the one was solely my company at first. The other one was with you and Joe Proctor, where we started Bellis Medical. That was about a year earlier. I was still with Ulthera at the time and kind of doing it on the side. And originally, my thought was I would leave Ulthera and do that 100%. But when I had this idea to start Xycrobe and I patented it, the kind of linchpin of not being able to kind of completely go in that other direction was because I went to Johnson & Johnson, who had just started an innovation center at their place in San Diego, at their headquarters in San Diego. And they accepted me into this incubation program based off of my idea. And I got an investor right away. And I felt like the signs were all telling me you should probably go this way, because people are throwing money at you. And now, did it always go that smoothly? Not even close. But I will tell you, at that time, all of my experience and ideas and the situation I was in all kind of pointed me in the direction of, you need to do this, because this is kind of a mark that you might be able to leave on science and medicine, rather than just going and working for another company and doing something that's just a commodity, or you know what I'm talking about. And so, not that those things are bad. It's just that my ambition was I wanted to leave something onto society, give something to society that actually took us in a better direction.
Okay, so you started Xycrobe Technology, and at some point you
Xycrobe Therapeutics.
Xycrobe Therapeutics, thank you. And at some point you landed on it, and of course the Xycrobe Therapeutics was focused on the skin microbiome, correct? And at some point you landed on the value that C. acnes can have on the health and beauty of the skin. How long did it take you to get to that point, Thomas?
Well, it depends on what you mean to get to that point, because I very quickly started doing that research, and it was very heavily influenced by research that was done at UCLA. So the skin microbiome was not really very well studied or talked about until around 2012. That's when metagenomics started catching up and allowing people to see more insight into the nuances of the skin microbiome. And if you look at like a literature search at 2012, that's when this started skyrocketing.
Okay.
There was visionaries like James Layden that we've talked to on our podcast before that, previous to that had a lot of insight. Interestingly, a lot of what he said was not really taken at face value until now, because while he had some insight, he didn't have all of the metagenomics necessary to back up. He didn't know about the different strains per se. He probably had thoughts of that. He just didn't have a lot of ways and instruments to really truly vet that out. So in 2012, a professor at UCLA published some literature that showed that everybody, whether they had acne or not, the majority, almost 90% on average, of what's in the hair follicles of the sebaceous areas of the skin, like the face and such, is C. acnes, the species C. acnes. And then she went further to delve into, okay, what are the different subspecies or types? They call them ribotypes. So they put them into little buckets based on their genetics. And they found that there's very strong associations with health or disease based on not the species, but the ribotypes. And that's when, for me, kind of, it was a light bulb moment where I said, that's what we need to do, because if everybody has it, that means that you cannot say that it's a bad species. We just need to find the correct ones and use those to help use as a vehicle. Because originally Xycrobe Therapeutics was not to necessarily put a probiotic in the skin, but was to use bacteria as vehicles for delivery of medicines, biotherapeutics. Okay.
So not a cosmetic
no
initiative to begin with
no.
whatsoever. It was a health of the skin, delivery
right.
of drug.
Right.
Oh, okay.
So the idea was, and it came from that interaction that I had early on, which was thinking, how in the world are these companies selling these topical creams and saying that these growth factors or whatever they're saying are getting into the skin and actually doing anything legitimately? And anytime I try to get questions, it was all very vague and dubious about how this is, it's all, anecdote and, opinion and such. And so I said, well, what would I do to kind of get past that? What would I do to actually legitimately get larger molecules down to where we need to throughout the thickness of the skin? And that's what I was like, well, we know bacteria live in every nook and cranny, basically. So if we could find the right bacteria, we could actually use them. And there was actually some companies that were in the gut space using lactobacillus that's probiotic for the gut, and they were trying to program them to secrete certain biotherapeutics. So I said, that's what I should do for the skin. Now, of course, interestingly, I had the idea and then found that they were doing that as well later. And so it was at first a little bit of a downer because I was like, okay, now I can't pursue that because, but then I realized, yes, I can, because it's skin. It's very different.
Yeah.
It's a different microorganism. It's a different mechanism. And so that's when I filed the patent, and eventually the patent was patented. It was patented. It was allowed. So we have 3 or 4 now, but, the whole idea was to find the right microbe. And everybody that I talked to was that was in the field of dermatology was saying you should use Staph epidermidis because that's the commensal microbe that's pretty plentiful. And I came across Dr. Lee's at UCLA's research, and I looked at that and I said, based off of this, I don't know if I agree, because if you think about the problem that I'm trying to address, which is how to get past the surface, if staph is only on the surface, then what's the point?
Right.
You're just doing the same thing,
prevalent
fancy.
one within the hair follicle, because I'm looking to get penetration of the skin.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
So
staph epidermidis is on top of the skin, but something very different in the hair follicles, is
right.
living and thriving in the hair follicles.
Right, because if you think about the morphology of the hair follicle, there's no stratum corneum. There's no barrier between what's in the follicle and the human cell. And even more so, a lot of the immune cells that are in the skin surround the follicles. And that's why, because there's no barrier there, so it's more prone to exposure. And so I was thinking to myself, and not only that, it's the whole thickness of the skin and below, because follicles extend below.
Subcutaneous
level.
So
I'm like, if I want to get the whole skin, why would I use something that's just
meaning
on the
epidermis,
surface?
dermal layer of the skin, all the way into the
Everything.
subcutaneous tissue.
Right. Yeah.
And a typical topical product, as you were talking about when
say
you
that
discovered
5 times fast.
Yeah, when you discover the need for something like this, cannot typically do that. Correct, Thomas?
Yeah. I mean, really, I would love to debate anybody that thinks that any topical, I mean, there's so many companies that are trying to get past the stratum corneum with whatever means. There's ultrasound, people use, liposomes. There's people that have tried all sorts of things to try to get past the stratum corneum. And what we found is the stratum corneum is there for a reason. Trying to get past it and get rid of it by whether it's exfoliation or whatever is not a good idea on a regular basis. So why in the world wouldn't we take the opportunity to use a mechanism that's already there, meaning the microbiome, to be the delivery vehicle? And that's kind of what my whole kind of premise was to start the company, was that if we program a bacteria that's already in the hair follicles to deliver a biotherapeutic, that's the best way to do it. Then, and part of the rationale was, for instance, IL-10, there was literature that showed that when you inject purified IL-10 under a psoriasis plaque, it helps. The problem is you have to put too much in there because it diffuses too quickly. because you put it into the body and then it's going to just start going everywhere. And that's the problem with most medicine and topicals, is that because it's so hard to pinpoint medicine to a particular problem area, you have to put way too much and you have these dosage spikes, and that leads to side effects and irritation and such. And so it's like you're using a hammer with a very small nail, because
thumbtack.
Yeah. But in medicine you have to do that, otherwise you can't get appropriate amount of medicine to the right place. And so my feeling was it's better to have a even small level, and I think most people would agree with most medicine, if you can find a small low level of even dosage. That's why you have those patches and stuff like that. It's better than these
continuous
spikes.
Yeah.
So that was the whole idea. Now, was it received well when I chose C. acnes? Absolutely not by most people. But the right people saw it, and they didn't understand it at first, but they trusted that myself and other people that were in the research area knew enough to know
that it had potential.
It had potential.
It had potential.
And that's how we got the funding, and we got Johnson & Johnson's buy-in in the incubator and such. And, it went pretty far. It's just there are certain logistical issues that must be overcome, because when you change any type of paradigm, you're going to have people that say, I have installed hundreds of millions of dollars worth of infrastructure, and now you're telling me I need to change it?
Yeah.
I mean, what would you say?
Yeah,
I mean,
fat chance.
Yeah.
That's the term I would use.
Yeah, and it's more or less what I heard.
Yeah, you meet resistance is the bottom line.
Yep.
Okay, so, Xycrobe Therapeutics has started. You have an objective to find a commensal bacteria that lives in the hair follicle for the sake of drug delivery.
Right.
At what point, and you landed on C. acnes, you said you met resistance to C. acnes. So talk to us a little bit more about that. Why did you feel so strongly about C. acnes? You said because of the prevalence in the skin. Was there anything else that kind of led you to believe that this was the right choice? Because others were saying, no, not necessarily. Thomas, I'm not sure I agree with you. So,
interestingly, there was actually one other company that started like within weeks of when we started. Like they put their patent in like, I think 2 weeks before we put ours in. And at one point when I found that out, because you don't find out until it's published, it's about a year after you file when it's published. And I remember when it came across my desk, once theirs had published, it was like literally like 2 weeks. And I had a little bit of heartburn, because I was like, oh, dang, does that mean we're done? Like, does that mean that
over? Yeah.
Can we not go any further? But, very much so, started to look at it and find out that they actually chose Staph epidermidis. And so they were doing something similar, but they chose Staph epidermidis. And they also had patented it for flagrin, which is for eczema, where we made ours broad. So we could basically, any cytokine. So it was different enough to where we felt there was no issue. And that we were correct, because we eventually got our patent allowed, and so did they. But I think they had to move on and do different things, because flagrin by itself, I don't think is, and if you look at their work, they're not even, I don't think, pursuing that anymore, because it didn't work probably.
So they obviously weren't looking for penetration, though, because Staph epidermidis lives on the surface of the skin. So that wasn't their objective, to get into the skin cells and immune cells at a high level to be able to deliver drug. Or was it? I'm
not sure. I did talk with them at one of their people, one of their founders at one point. We didn't really get into too much detail about what I do know is that we were both at very similar conferences, and eventually they started doing programs very similar to what we were, whether that's just coincidence or just common sense, I don't know, or whether they saw, that we were doing it and thought that's a good idea. But they ended up doing a program with like IL-10, which is what we were very focused on. And, so it's one of those things where I think common sense probably more so led them. Even if they did see us first, they probably said, yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Yeah.
Because the flagrin thing, I think is it's a long shot, but.
So at some point, as we know now, as we're on the brink of, or actually in process of, starting to introduce BIOJUVE as a living biome care line for the skin, for the care of the skin. We know at some point you transitioned into not necessarily drug benefit, but using this opportunity to leverage C. acnes, and we know now a very specific subspecies and actually a patented and or a proprietary strain that you've harnessed to have cosmetic benefits. So, at what point, Thomas, was the switch then from drug delivery to cosmesis?
So really, that happened organically. Because we were very heavily putting our resources at the time with Dr. Munsuri, who was kind of my lead scientist. We were very much putting our resources into pursuing acne at that point with the IL-10 strains, and that was simply because a lot of our funding was from somebody. It was a philanthropist who was very passionate about solving issues for children, and acne being a very big prevalent thing that children suffer from in their when they hit puberty. He invested for that reason. And then, of course, Johnson & Johnson was one of our investors, and they put the most of anybody into our company. And they, of course, were very interested in acne as well. And so while we were doing the research, though, because we were testing this particular strain that we had developed, as well as the wild type strains that we had gotten them from. And frankly, it's funny because their lead scientist at Johnson & Johnson, she basically asked, how did you land on this strain? Like, how lucky were you? Because it's, you're trying to find the best strain possible. And I had this kind of checklist of desires. And, it was funny because it was a vendor that was coming to like change our trash or something. And I had my scientist, I was like, swab everybody and get everybody's, microbes and then put them in a petri dish. And then we'll use that as a bank to start screening. And, we were finding lots of C. acnes, of course, and we getting lots of staph epidermidis. And there was days where I felt like I was do you remember that movie?
Finding a needle in the haystack?
Yeah. Do you remember that movie Gremlins?
Of course.
Do you remember that scene where up in the attic after they've transitioned to Gremlins and like slimes over everything? And there's days we came in and there's petri dishes that basically overnight had grown slime, and you're like, this is a mess. Like, how are we going to find this strain? But this one guy comes in to change our trash, swabs them, and then the rest is history. He signed a waiver. We're never going to tell who it is. And so,
by any chance, yeah.
And so that particular strain that we grew turned out to. There was a few things that I won't get into as far as what I was looking for, because some of it's proprietary, but that showed me that it was of the subspecies and a particular ribotype that I felt was going to be conducive to skin health. And so there is some serendipity into science, right? You sometimes when you're in the right place and you make the right observation at the right time, you land on things. There's a lot of examples in history where you're sitting somewhere and something happens and it strikes that right chord, like the whole Newton and the apple on the head thing. And I think it was Da Vinci who sat in the bathtub and the boat rose, and it gave him the whole concept of buoyancy. And so there's a lot of times in history that's happened to a scientist where something will happen and it just clicks. And there's a couple times during the development of the Xycrobe technology where that happened. And one of them was when we were doing the research and we realized when we were causing inflammation in these human cell constructs, or even in petri dishes or in explants or whatever, we noticed a trend that every time we would cause inflammation on purpose, when we would add the Xycrobe, which was with the IL-10 strain, which we were working on for acne, it would reduce it. But the wild type strain that we had manipulated to not grow also reduced it. And a lot now, of course, when it was a diseased state, it was not as significant, but in normative state, it was exactly the same. And so both for the disease state as well as the normal state cells that we were studying, we were seeing this very strong trend that the bacteria itself carried a lot of weight when it came to reducing inflammation. And so in my head, I started to think, wait a second here. If this is the case, then why aren't we just curating everybody's microbes?
Bacteria, because they're releasing something, obviously,
yeah, there's something
that's
happening,
contributing to that reduction in inflammation.
Exactly.
Essentially.
We didn't program it to spit anything special out.
So there was a transition of your thought, it sounds like, into delivery of something to My goodness, they're already secreting something.
Yes.
How do we leverage
Well, the thing is, they're
that?
delivering. They're always delivering.
They're always delivering something.
So the
whether
fact
you
is,
program them to
exactly.
deliver it or whether they're naturally
Well,
delivering it.
yeah, and this is where this is kind of this was a light switch moment, which is, oh, I don't want to say an expletive, but oh bleep.
Darn.
You know, oh bleep. It's like, if you think about it, you have billions, and if anybody's heard me talk, this is my little catchphrase, you have billions of bacteria on your face, no matter how clean you think you are.
Mm-hmm.
And those bacteria, every one of them, are constantly secreting something.
Good or bad.
Good or bad. And so why in the world would we not take that seriously versus just trying to stick a topical on somebody? Why don't we first think about which bacteria are secreting what things? Because that's happening all the time. And no matter how many cleansers or peels or anything that you use, you're always going to have it. And so that's when I said, we need to now take this seriously. What is the correct strain you need on your face, and how can we curate that? And that's kind of where we switch directions.
And that's where you switch directions. Okay. So now you've decided there's a particular strain. And when you say wild type, you're talking about the subspecies, right? C. acnes defendens you had already landed on?
So wild type is just what's found in nature. So like we talk about, like in genetics, when we say wild type, it means what the genetics should be. So if we have a mutation that we cause or something, that's a specific mutation, and wild type's, normal genetics. So when I say wild type, it's because we have ones that we put genetic switches into. Those are considered the engineered ones. And then we have the wild type ones, which are the ones that you'd find in nature.
Okay.
And so that's just a genetic designation that we use, wild type.
Okay.
So yes.
C. acnes defendens then is a wild type, because that's
It is a wild subspecies, yes.
Okay.
Wild
it's
type.
a wild subspecies.
Yep.
But there was a particular strain of C. acnes defendens that you isolated.
Right.
And then programmed in some respect to be able to release more, because you found out that this particular strain released some of the daily needs of the skin in terms of care of the skin, some very essential proteins and polypeptides, antioxidants, and so forth, correct?
Correct. And so I wouldn't call it programming. I would call it, we put a genetic switch in there. And the reason why that's a particular designation is because the idea was we don't want to mess with the overall function other than cell division, meaning when any cell divides, most of its energy is spent towards replicating its DNA so that there's no mistakes. Because the thing is, propagation of a cell, you want to make sure you don't cause a mutation, because that leads to disease a lot of times, or something not functioning properly. So a lot of, when we divide our cells, a lot of the energy goes through that. It goes into cell division and not to metabolism. And so we know that when you look at a bacteria, when it actually has a growth curve, and you see there's a growth or a log phase where it's dividing, and then there's this phase called stationary, where once it gets to a place where it's like there's way too many of us in this room, and there's very limited resources, so we're just going to kind of chill and stop growing. So then it switches different genes on to metabolizing versus growing.
And metabolizing is the emission of?
It's the eating of foods and then the creation of other things.
Okay.
And so a lot of times people call like ferment products the poop of bacteria, which I say that's super reductive, because it's not. A lot of times what bacteria does is what I call microbioforming. And I think I made up that term, so trademark it. But anyway, microbioforming is basically, if you think of science fiction, where they go to a planet and they have to terraform it. It's the same idea, as that a bacteria, a lot of people think of them as like these free-floating planktonic things, but on the skin and in the gut, that's not typically how they establish a niche. What they do is they go to a place that they find conducive to living, and they'll start to secrete things like biofilms. It's like building a house. In medicine, biofilms have been kind of villainized because they are associated with infections on implants and such. But in reality, that's how bacteria actually engrafts onto the skin and in the gut as well, is that they form these biofilms and they kind of make these little houses, and then they kind of, just like we would make the creature comforts of our house, the right temperature, and they do the same thing. They spit out stuff that basically is antimicrobial for other bad microbes. They spit out antioxidants to protect them from oxidative damage, from radical species and stuff, free radical species. And
So they're secreting to create the proper environment for their existence.
Exactly.
But in that process that they're creating that same environment that could be beneficial for the skin.
Exactly.
In different respects.
100%.
In our case, for cosmetic benefit.
Right. And you can, I mean, just like in any ecosystem, there's a lot of things that animals do that may help us. Like, for instance, earthworms, they don't think about the fact that they're aerating the soil to help for vegetable growth. They just know that they're
just doing
building
their
tunnels
job.
to get to their food source or
Yeah.
whatever. Same with ants, or beavers. Beavers don't build a dam because they're like, you know what, I really need to make a marshy area so that the ecosystem can thrive here. No, they're building a
Yeah.
dam because that's what they do. That's their function. They don't know that they're having an impact overall. And the same with the microbiome is that they don't cognitively think, you know what, I think, Angela needs me to really raise the antioxidant levels here. No, they think, I'm at the surface of this follicle. I really send some oxygen here. Let's make sure we fortify the antioxidants here. And you know what? I also see some Staph epidermidis and Staph aureus around. So let's spit out these antimicrobials, just basically put a flag in the ground to say, this is C. acnes
Spot.
town.
Yeah.
And really it's not until people step over boundaries in the microbiome world that you start to have problems, because bacteria can fight. They can react based on who's in their house and such. And there's a lot of research that's going on about interspecial and even inter strain conversations that occur between microbes that can actually lead to irritation of the skin. And so these things are nuanced things that most people and even most clinicians at this point may not appreciate, and we're trying to kind of get that type of mentality going. And these are the things that I've spent the last several years kind of trying to get enough research and tell the right stories in order to get people to start paying attention that maybe it's more nuanced than we once thought.
Okay, so let's step back a little bit. So you isolate the particular strain of C. acnes defendants. You add a genetic switch, which allows it to spend less time or spend less energy replicating or growing and more energy producing these nutrients that essentially were going to create cosmetic benefit for the skin, health and cosmetic benefit for the skin.
That's right.
And
Well, at
so
first
now
I was pretty sure health. I didn't know about cosmetic benefit.
Okay.
And that was a little scary because, when you're trying to like get people to do stuff, not everybody cares as much about health as they do about looking good.
That's when Joe and I were saying, that's cute, Thomas, but can you get rid of wrinkles?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yep.
so first you were thinking health of the skin, and then you start to do the studies, and you're like, oh boy, wait a minute, we got a little something extra here going on. And you patented this particular proprietary strain, which
early on, even when I started the company, I patented it.
you patented that particular strain. As soon as you discovered that particular strain,
Well,
was that a patent?
let's just
or
say
was
that the strain isn't particularly patented. It is anything that is like that. So you patent something that describes what you're looking for, and so you find it. So it's not like I found that strain and that particular strain's patented. It's just that certain criteria that describe that strain. That's what's patented.
Okay. And then that is, tell us what happens next. So you thought you were building a story around the health of the skin. Then you start to realize, at what point did you realize, oh boy, we've got something that's actually providing cosmetic benefit to the skin? At what point did that become obvious to you, Thomas? And then where did you take that from that point?
I think the first clue was when we did a very crude, I don't know if crude is the right word, but very small pilot study. It was when we were still a very small company. It was before we were acquired by Crown. But I knew that if I was to raise the money that I needed to take it to the next level, I had to show some sort of inhuman benefit. I knew that it would, in my gut, I knew we were going to get healthier skin because of all the research we had done and all the research other people had done as well. It's just I didn't know how it would manifest. And so, of course, I was the first person, and so I would have Munsu. I wouldn't even let him know at first, but I would tell him I just want little cultures to grow up in test tubes, and I would just take those cultures home, and I would resuspend them in saline, and I would just apply them to my face, like in the billions, and I would just like let that
Hope
sit.
for the best.
Well, I you
knew.
I knew, but at the same time, I was like, I
You
would
wanted to
never
be the
feel
first.
comfortable
Yeah.
doing it to somebody and then them get a bunch of acne for life or something like that.
Right.
It's the same story of the guy who claimed that there was a gut bacteria, Helicobacter pylori, I believe it's called, and he claimed that it was what causes ulcers. And if we could get rid of that, it would help us. And nobody believed him, and so he went home and he took a culture and he got a bunch of ulcers, cured himself, and then the rest is history. And so there's a lot of mad scientists that I shouldn't call them mad. They're not crazy. They're just ones that realize
thirst for finding the truth of something,
well,
exploring the truth.
You get pissed off because people don't believe you.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you
So
go to
you're
all
willing
this
to accept
schooling.
acne for life just to prove you're right.
Yeah. I mean, you go through all this schooling and then you take years and years to prove a point. And if somebody still says, I don't believe you, I even had a guy call me delusional. You
I wonder
know,
what he'd say now.
what?
I wonder what he'd say
I don't
now.
know. I don't care.
Can we find him?
I don't want to. But, you know, it's basically, it's like, you get all that and then you start to get a little pissed off because it's like you see all these other small startups that are producing BS stuff, getting funding and taking off. And you're like, I have something that legitimately changes a paradigm. And you guys don't even want to look at me because you don't have the vision, you know? And so you're like, I'm going to shove it in your face. I'm going to show you the vision by shoving it in my face. And so I literally would just put for probably several weeks, I would just every day have Munsu, and I'm sure that Munsu was pissed at me for having him do this work.
And he had no idea that you were taking these home.
Not at
and
first,
applying
not
them.
at first. But I had, like, if you looked at my refrigerator, there's little like test tubes.
I was wondering what all those were at that time.
So finally I got to the point where I'm like, you know, we didn't have like the sophisticated camera equipment
Sure.
to like do any, but I did know I wasn't getting any acne.
Yeah.
And so I said, we got to do a study. So we did a 10 patient study and, you know, we probably didn't choose all the best patients because really I just wanted a smattering of different people, old, young, acne, not acne. I just wanted to see how people reacted to it, that it was safe and that it wouldn't hurt them. And there was one guy that was actually a friend of mine that did it just to be nice for me. And he didn't have any acne per se, but when you really zoomed in, he had a lot of open comedones. He had a lot of blackheads on his nose and in the sebaceous regions. And at first, you know, we took the pictures of it, and of course, for anybody that gets a very zoomed in image of their skin, it's a little bit jarring and uncomfortable because it's not attractive for pretty much anybody. There was one girl that's like, you couldn't find a pore even zoomed in. I'm like, I hate you, and
Get out of my lab.
get out of my get out of my study.
Never want to see you again.
But interestingly, she did have some hormonal acne, and it did clear up when she was done with the study.
Okay.
But you know, as far as health and beauty for this gentleman, it was really the first time that I noticed a significant difference. And so when you looked at his sebaceous filaments, they were all very black because of the oxidation in the air and such. And so, you know, most people with acne are like, it's an overgrowth of C. acnes, right? In my mind, I'm thinking, because I'd already seen literature and in our own studies that the C. acnes strain that we were producing caused huge amounts of antioxidants to be put into the ferment. And so I said, well, my guess is what's going to happen is these C. acnes are going to eat those filaments and prohibit the oxidation, and it's exactly what we saw. And part of why I thought that was because one of the things I noticed when I first started putting on my face was that I noticed my pores at first looked more obvious because it would eat everything. I put too many on. They ate everything like...
just cleaned out the pores and
completely.
left them looking more open or larger.
Yeah, because there was...
There was nothing blocking it.
Right, so the sebum in there actually masks it a little bit. So everybody has pores, but some people have they're more masked because the filaments are filled with sebum, which is a wax of sorts. And it's like when you fill wax into a table scrape, it's still there. It's just it's masked
plug,
now,
right?
Yeah, it's basically it masks it because of light, the way the light reflects and such. And so that's why I was like something's. And so when we saw that, basically not only were the filaments way smaller, they were also way lighter. So you didn't see blackheads; you just saw normal skin, unless you really zoomed in and saw you could see where the filaments were. But that's the first time that I said, okay, so I think this is something somebody would pay for. Because people are taking those Biore strips and stuff, and that's really bad because you need the oils, you need the filament. The thing is, you don't want to stop the oils, which was what tretinoins were doing. You don't want to just pull everything out, which is what those strips were doing. You don't want to overwash and strip the skin of all. The thing is, what you want to do is make sure that it's balanced. And so part of that is putting the right bacteria on that eats all that stuff and produces the stuff from those oils. And that's really the beginning of when I was like, okay, I know something will happen. I just don't know how much.
The extent of what will happen. I knew there was cosmetic benefit, and quickly too, right? Because you were seeing change in the blackheads within 3 weeks.
Yeah, I don't know when it would, like, when's the cutoff, but that's when we took the
captured
pictures.
It in pictures at 3 weeks. Okay, so that was you're clear. Okay, we've got something cosmetic. We need to take this further.
Mm-hmm.
So where did you, I'm going to just kind of slow down there a little bit because obviously this is Xycrobe technology. These are the microbial powerhouses that are the technology behind the BIOJUVE skin biome line. And so we've talked a lot about a lot today, Thomas. And I just want to end, as a scientist, as a visionary, as someone who's thinking beyond the levels that most of us think, quite honestly, in a day's time. Yeah,
Maybe
it's
sometimes.
true. It's true. Well, let me speak for myself.
All right.
Beyond what I'm thinking in a day's time, where you're always looking to solve something. When you look back and think about what you have built over the last year, it's 8 years, excuse me. What was the why? What was the why behind it all?
I think it's kind of what I covered earlier, which is, I think everybody kind of has this desire to leave their stamp on humanity. And it's a big ask, right? Because who are we, that are greater than all these millennia of people that have come before us and have done something that's left a mark? Because it's very difficult to do something new that nobody's thought of. And so not everybody has that ambition or that drive. Some people just want to live happy lives, which I do. But for me, it was very important that I wanted to feel like I did something that left the world better than when I joined it. And part of that has always been that I've never been able to take just because I said so for an answer. It's always been one of the things that caused me to have temper tantrums because I do not like that type of thinking that you would do something simply because it is the status quo. I think in history, that's when we get ourselves into trouble. It's been the people in history that have said, I can't accept the status quo because I think it's wrong, that have caused trouble, but at the end made society better. If you think about all of the people in history that have changed the world, most of them were not really thought of well at the time, but since then you've noticed that they've caused a significant change. And I think any true scientist kind of has that urge to want to discover something unique. That's when you get a doctorate, you are told it's because you have delivered something to the world that is unique. But in a certain sense, it's kind of a semantics thing. It's like, yeah, but it's not really changing the world. It's just you did some research that's different by a little bit from somebody else. But I really wanted to change something that I saw as a problem and change a whole paradigm. And that was really what drove me, is that I didn't know I was doing it at first, but when I saw that opportunity, I said, I don't want to just let this go because I'm looking at the way that people struggle with these issues. And it's because we're doing things the wrong way because we just didn't know any better. And if I leave it alone, it's going to perpetuate
for who knows how long.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that I would be the only one. There are other people that speak similarly, have a very similar philosophy to mine. It's just a lot of people don't have the ability to propagate that message. And so that's my why, is that I feel like my philosophy is kind of the cutting edge of what we should be doing in dermatology. And I feel like there is resistance still for a number of reasons, but none of it is legitimate because it's better for mankind. I think that once we get past the logistical issues, I think most people will go in this direction. And that's kind of why I wanted to do it. I knew it was a challenge. I've never shied from a challenge. It's always what's driven me. Usually it's when I feel that I can do it, I decide I'm over it.
Right.
I almost didn't finish my PhD because I was like, I could do it. I'm almost there. So why even, I'm poor. I need to make money. So might as well quit.
Yeah.
But my dad convinced me to stick it through, and I'm glad he did. So.
Well, we're glad he did. And, I'm going to leave it right there because I love, what you said is very poignant. And, and as your friend and colleague, thank you for, seeing it through.
Well, thank you. You've been a cheerleader for me.
I have been, and I'll want compensation for that when the time comes. We can talk about that later.
I'll give you some free Xycrobe.
So no, next episode, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what does that look like to bring that level of technology to fruition from a commercialization standpoint.
Piece of cake.
So yeah, a walk in the park, right?
Yeah.
But thank you for your time today.
Yep. Where do they find you on social media?
you can find me at Angela W. McDonald. And I'd love to hear from you. And Thomas, where can we find you in social media?
You can find me at dr.t.hitchcock on Instagram. I really don't have a lot of other socials, but you could also go to crownlaboratories.com if you want to watch series like our Beauty and the Bacteria, which I really strongly suggest you do for this topic, at least episodes 1, 9, and 10. That's about it.
Very good.
So thank you. Thank you for your eyes and ears. We hope you learned something from this conversation, and we hope to see you back the next time. Goodbye for now.